Hey guys. So today in our next Hypermobile Hangout, I want to talk to you guys about a rather uncommon, possibly unpopular, I'll be very interested to hear what you guys have to say about it, piece of training advice for hypermobile individuals. So my piece of advice for you guys today is every once in a while when you are training, particularly with something new or maybe something that you haven't been very confident on in the past, try distracting yourself. And I know that's a weird one. So before anyone's over there like, what do you mean? Like, that's so unprofessional. I don't mean distract yourself to the point where you're like, not paying attention to your surroundings and tripping over things, because that would not be good. But I do mean distracting yourself in the way that I think it's quite important that hypermobile individuals do spend some time focusing on non-intentional, non-conscious movement. And I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of how this technique even occurred to me, or kind of I've developed. But first, I want to tell you guys a little bit about the rationale behind them. And the first, and I think probably most important reason that we every once in a while need to just get out of our own heads when it comes to movement is that I think in the hypermobile community, there, particularly people who are, manifesting hypermobility as pain symptoms, as instability, or, just kind of discomfort, there is this big fear of movement making things worse. And I think that fear creates this idea that we need to be always like moving to perfection, and that we need to be having great form in everything we do. And this idea that we need to be consciously focused on it all the time. And what I mean by that is, just doing, not even necessarily an exercise, but just, walking down the street. Am I hyperextending my knees? Oh, okay, I have to adjust that. Am I firing my glutes, my bum? Oh, I need to get that going. When you reach up overhead to put something on a shelf, are my arms pressed, or are my shoulders pressed down away from my ears? Oh, I've got to adjust that. And not to say that being conscious of these things is necessarily a bad thing, but it can be really overwhelming if you're thinking about that kind of stuff all the time. And even beyond that, you might be putting yourself, even though, it might be anatomically good form, you might be putting yourself in a position that your body is just not ready for. If keeping your shoulders perfectly away from your ears while you're reaching up overhead is still very challenging, maybe on your neck stability, maybe on your thoracic extension, your upper back, it might actually be doing more harm than good. And so I think this idea of creating a bit of a distraction for yourself can actually be to a benefit, because it gets you out of this constant cycle of, oh, I need to be moving perfectly. Oh, I'm afraid if I'm not. And then the second kind of rationale for this piece of advice, which I'll delve into a little deeper in a second, is probably one of my favorite phrases I've ever heard uttered about hypermobility. And I heard it when I was teaching this workshop a few months ago, and I sat in on this one physical therapist's workshop, and she was talking about myofascial integrity. And she kind of tangented for a second and started talking about how basically the myofascial system in hypermobile individuals and how it's quite different. And she was basically just like, well, of course, like hypermobile people are just like all unstable and feeling weird. She was like, they can't even feel their effing feet on the floor. And I was like, that resonated so deeply, because it's true. I think it's pretty uncontested at this point that hypermobility and the way hypermobile people experience their proprioception is quite skewed. And so for those of you that may not know, proprioception is basically your awareness of where your body is in space and how you relate to that. And like I mentioned, it's pretty uncontested at this point that hypermobile proprioception is quite a bit different, and we often can't even feel our effing feet on the floor, and it's because our bodies are constantly subconsciously just trying to micro stabilize all of these lax ligaments across our entire body, that's exceptionally fatiguing, you know? And so this idea that we should be kind of feeling movement the same way as someone who isn't hypermobile is quite, you know, is quite unrealistic. And that's just not, it's really just not realistic for the hypermobile community. And so that actually brings kind of as a nice segue into why I kind of developed this idea of creating distraction for yourself in exercise. And it stemmed from this continuing education course I took a couple years ago. Probably the most interesting one I've done to date. It was called Pilates for Neurological Conditions. And it was led by this woman named Mariska Breland. So shout out to you, my dear, because it was a really good one. And basically this entire course was exactly what it sounds like. It's teaching different techniques using like the Pilates style movements for people with MS, for people with Parkinson's disease, and just different neurological disorders. And during this workshop, it was like a series. During this series, she gave this one cue, this one technique, and basically said, you know, kind of paraphrasing, that this idea that you should be constantly cueing, oh, like, do this exercise and you should feel it in your arms, or, oh, do a squat and do you feel it in your glutes, was very unrealistic for individuals with these different neurological disorders. And I believe she was talking about both MS and Parkinson's. I'll have to go back and check, but that didn't kind of sink in for me until much, you know, like probably 6 or 7 months later, as I was kind of thinking a lot more about hypermobility and learning more about it, how incredibly kind of impactful that cue can be for hypermobile individuals as well. Because whereas in neurological disorders, there is an actual kind of physical disruption of the myelin sheaths, the kind of brain receptors and whatnot. And though, to my knowledge, hypermobility doesn't have that same disruption, I think that same cue can still so realistically be applied to the hypermobile community, of not just focusing on a specific area or a specific movement. Because oftentimes I hear, like in sessions, I feel it with myself, you know, I'm doing a movement and it's like something I'm supposed to maybe feel in my glutes or my forearm, and I just don't. And that doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, I'm doing the movement incorrectly. It might just be that maybe those neural pathways are a little weaker and it's something I've got to work on. It might just be that my body is so used to being in these kind of hyperextended, hypermobilized positions that it's not used to firing in those specific spots. And so basically all of that to say that I kind of took this cue and this idea of like, okay, we should not always have to be so specific and so kind of honed in and conscious about our movements. It is so important that hypermobile people build confidence in unconscious movement. I mean, I think a great example is this whole time, I mean, now I'm thinking about it, but I have been talking with my hands and moving and just whatever and shifting, and we need to reestablish a confidence in daily movements, you know, like I was mentioning earlier, just walking down the street and not focusing on, is my posture straight? Are my hips moving well? Are my, you know, feet touching where they're supposed to? Because those are the kinds of things that over time can be very fatiguing for your body, and actually like can negatively impact it. Because if you're consciously having to think about the way you walk, then that unconscious walking isn't happening very easily. So going back to this idea of distracting yourself every once in a while, I'm going to reiterate, I don't mean just like looking all about and not watching where you are, because I don't want anyone to fall over. But one technique that, this might be extremely unpopular for people, one technique I started using when I was really thinking about this, and I was training myself because I didn't, at the time, really didn't have an instructor that was equipped with dealing with hypermobility and kind of all the different neural sensations and weirdness that comes with that. I started watching Hulu while I worked out, and it was, I was watching a sitcom, and I would be on my side doing my clamshells and doing my leg raises, but I found it so beneficial. I found it so helpful to kind of being like, okay, my body's like knows what it needs to do. It needs to do its 10 clamshells and its 10 leg raises and whatever. But my conscious brain was kind of focused on something else. And I found that so powerful. And what really helped was that eventually I got to a place where I didn't necessarily need that distraction anymore, because my confidence in movement had built up enough. My confidence in not needing to focus so much on every little detail really just built to now I'm at a point where I don't really need distractions for myself. I just feel more comfortable being like, okay, I have moved. I've moved effectively and don't necessarily need to focus on every single piece and movement, because it's so overwhelming, and oftentimes actually did more harm than good, because I found I was like bracing and being way too kind of like self-critical, I guess is the word. I was like focusing way too much on perfectionism. But so by using, in my case, Hulu as kind of an external distraction, I found my movement patterns and my confidence in those movement patterns actually improved a lot. And so, for some people, it might not be Hulu. It might be Netflix. Just kidding. But, it might be something else entirely. It might be having a podcast on in the background. It might be listening to an album you really like. But I really do think that this concept of giving yourself something to focus on externally from your body. I mean, you could be having a conversation. I mean, if you're in a cardio workout, you might need your breath a little bit, but you could be having a conversation with someone, whatever it is. And I also do want to caveat this moment with, this isn't necessarily a technique I use every single day. It's not necessarily a technique I use with every single exercise. This is a technique that I have used on myself and on other people realistically with exercises that maybe I've been a little uncomfortable with in the past, exercises that have, I'll admit, exercises that have maybe scared me a little bit. For me, for a long time, like any sort of back extension, so like back bending kind of stuff, was very challenging and tended to just kind of spark up stuff in my lower back and my sacrum. And so I literally started like turning on Hulu to a sitcom I really liked, and started listening to that so that I could kind of get out of my own head and give myself something else to focus on while I worked through these exercises that realistically I knew I needed to be doing, and now I can do with much, much more ease. And we're talking like a few months later here. So all of that to say, I mean, I think this is just one of many very important techniques that should be employed when it comes to hypermobility and training. I'm very interested to hear what you guys have to think about it. I am sure some people out there are kind of like, well, what the heck is she talking about? But I am hoping that some of you guys, can give this a try and just recognize that this isn't about, distracting yourself or not being like a good fitness person or whatever. But it's about distracting yourself for the purpose of, getting out of that fear mindset and recognizing that sometimes you just need a hand for it. And if you don't have someone there guiding you along, it can be a very, very useful technique. I will freely admit that sometimes what I do in studio with my hypermobile clients is like, you can tell when someone is bracing or like fearful of a movement, and it, typically is something that's not something to be afraid of, but everyone's fear is valid for different reasons. But it's often because it's something that has caused pain in the past, so they stop breathing and they get afraid. And one thing I do is, that is the moment I'll just start asking them about their weekend, and I'll say like, oh, let's breathe, and I'll really try to get them out of this idea of like, okay, I'm on my back and I need to lift my knee up perfectly, and these are the muscles I need to use and all of this stuff. And I find that oftentimes when I'm giving people a little bit something else to focus on, that's when that fluidity and that just beautiful activation and that beautiful breath really starts to come through. So like I said, though this might be like a rather controversial technique, and it's definitely something that I'm still developing and utilizing, I'd be very interested to hear what you guys get out of it and how you guys feel about it. But with that being said, that is going to be our Hypermobile Hangout for the day. So thank you all for joining me, and I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day. Bye.